my name is Ileana Zuckerman, and today I'm going to share my research with you. Aspasia beyond her ideology, grounding her historical existence. To start, I'm going to introduce Aspasia. Aspasia was from Asia Minor, and she moved to Athens around 450 BCE. In Athens, she was recorded in the comedic plays as a sex worker. However, in the Socratic tradition that followed, she was recorded more as a philosopher and rhetorician. In the 1990s, there was a resurgence of trying to understand who Aspasia truly was back in classical Athens. And my research is going to build upon this discussion. I aim to continue the discourse of recovering Aspasia of Miletus, employing the methodology of new historicism. This approach allows me to give agency back to Aspasia as I reify and emphasize her ability to navigate the liminal spaces of a changing classical Athens and become arguably one of the most influential rhetoricians of her time. To do this, I'm going to build off of the literature already written about Aspasia. So this includes Henry's Prisoner of History, Glenn's Sex, Lies, and Manuscript, Jarrett and Ong's Aspasia's Rhetoric, Gender, and Colonial Ideology, and Gale's Historical Studies and Postmodernism. The emphasis of this previous scholarship is one, on Aspasia's otherness, and two, on Aspasia as a sex worker. However, in trying to defend Aspasia against the claims that have been made against her, scholars unintentionally corroborate said claims. So this can be seen when we look at Aspasia's otherness. Um, these scholars emphasize Aspasia as an other by being a foreigner and a woman, and an authorized other by being the only woman in the polis. So there were a lot of women in ancient Athens who were foreigner and women. So that is an other that Aspasia existed in. However, she becomes an authorized other as she enters this male-dominated sphere in the polis. So what made Aspasia move from an other to an authorized other? This is not really explored in the literature. Aspasia is also emphasized as an other from being separate from men. A lot of scholarship emphasizes that we need to explore Aspasia for her own sake rather than in relation to Socrates and Pericles and the men that she's often associated with. However, Aspasia's accomplishments were recorded in history because of her ability to interact with these men. It does not make sense to try to isolate Aspasia from her relationship to these men. It doesn't make sense to other her from these men when we know about her because she was breaking into spheres dominated and made for men. We can also see the same trend in exploring Aspasia as a sex worker. So these scholars often feel the need to defend Aspasia against the claim of her being a sex worker. This reinforces two main ideas. One, that being a sex worker is bad, and two, this reinforces the idea that there cannot be a conversation about Aspasia and her contributions to academia without addressing the issue of her being a sex worker, which basically implies that her being a sex worker either validates or invalidates her contributions to academia, which I do not think needs to be true. Um, and this builds to my second point that Aspasia's reputation as a sex worker should not be brought up in a conversation about Aspasia's contribution to academia unless they are exploring Aspasia's time and reputation as a sex worker and how that might have influenced her philosophical and rhetorical beliefs. Because of all of this, I wanted to look at Aspasia in a way that she has not been looked at yet, which is through the methodology of new historicism. New historicism is not has no universal truths, and you have to look at the context in which texts were written. It moves the question from who is speaking to what play of forces made it possible for a particular speaking subject to emerge, which I think is a better way to look at Aspasia when we have such limited evidence of who she is. So looking at the archaeological record and other texts from ancient Athens with including the cultural norms and the laws and the customs, we can create a fabric of what ancient Athens that Aspasia lived in looked like, and then we can try to weave a path through that to try to understand where Aspasia would have fit in. And new historicism allows us to do that. And it also allows us to acknowledge that there could be multiple paths, but we at least get to start filling in a picture. So I argue that through new historicism, Aspasia was probably a hetera, a high class sex worker, and that through this position she met Pericles and she used her education and her knowledge to then start influencing the very influential men of the day, like Pericles and Socrates. All in all, new historicism allows us to take Aspasia off the pedestal that historians often place her upon. she did break many cultural many patriarchal norms in the day, and she shows us that the powerful woman existed in the past. However, she did not exist to be this person that broke patriarchal norms in the past. She existed for herself and happened to do this along the way. And I think new historicism allows us to understand Aspasia for Aspasia's sake than Aspasia for the feminist sake of today. And to conclude, Aspasia was more than just a woman who existed to confront the patriarchal society um, of the past and present. She was a woman who took advantage of the opportunities presented to her and became one of the most influential rhetoricians of the day within the polis. Um, so that's my presentation on Aspasia, and thank you for listening.